So in our last video, we were talking about the psychological and social causes to depression. And now I kind of want to get more into the biological and somewhat social as well aspects. So something to note about depression is that most episodes of depression are preceded by some sort of stressful life event. That's a fact, which is really interesting, right? So it's not that all stressors will cause depression, right? But what you see is that if you have become depressed, a lot of the times it's because of some sort of stressful life event. And we can think about how experiencing a stressor, and then if you have this kind of negative cognitive style, right, you're thinking negatively about the world and about yourself, and if you're, experiencing that rumination, why did bad things always happen to me, right? You can imagine that would compound that stressor and might make you feel depressed, where you feel very down, worthless, you might withdraw from a lot of your activities. So these things are interacting with each other, right? So just because you have a stressor, you also need some of these other kind of cognitive factors, for example, that might lead to those depressive symptoms. One part of what we've learned about is a lot about stress hormones. So if we think about stress, when we experience stress, our HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which basically is the hypothalamus is in your brain, and when it kind of senses stress, it sends out some signals to the pituitary gland, which then sends out signals to your adrenal glands to actually produce a lot of stress hormones. This could be something that is, right, you have like kind of the fight or flight response that happens immediately, but over time, you have this longer lasting stress hormones that come out, one of which is called the cortisol. So cortisol, which comes out of your adrenal cortex, kind of flows through your body, through your brain, and it's supposed to be beneficial. In the short term, it is really beneficial. It helps you to deal with stress. However, what we know is that repeated activation and increased levels of cortisol might lead to depression, or if you have depression, it might lead to those. So we don't really know if it's correlation or causation, but typically what we see is that they're linked. So if a person is depressed, they tend to have too much cortisol in their system. But we don't know if that's a cause or a consequence of the depression. So cortisol is actually really beneficial in the short term, but too much of it can be bad for you. So we'll watch a couple of minutes of this TED-Ed video about chronic stress to kind of think about how this might happen in depression.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
So you may be asking yourself, okay, well, that's what happens with chronic stress, but is this what's happening in depression? And it seems like, yeah. We do see that there is smaller hippocampi, and more cell death. And we also see that there's a lot of biases in memories. So individuals with depression are way less likely to remember things positive that happened to them, and way more likely to focus on the negative things. So we do see that there is some difficulties that people have that is very similar to what chronic stress actually does to you. So one thing I want to get into is whether or not this idea that depression is just a chemical imbalance, where it came from, and also, is it true? So, I see this a lot in memes and stuff, like, the only things that matter are dopamine and serotonin, right? So they have these little things like our depression is low dopamine and low serotonin, and our love is high levels of that and oxytocin. We have all of those things. But one of the things I want to get into is kind of like the history of how did we get here, where we are now saying depression is just a chemical imbalance, talking about medications and how they work, and then what the actual measurement of serotonin really says about these chemical imbalances. So the history of this, in the 1950s, we started to see our first drug treatments for depression. And back then it was like, oh, we have this hypertension medication, and oh my gosh, these people are now, less depressed than they were before. That's great news. And so they started going, okay, well, let's try this out and see whether or not this is now going to reduce depression in the future, right? So in more people. And so they started giving it out and they realized, yeah, it does. And one of the other things that was going on during this time is that they found that there were neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters do have some effect on behavior, and can influence our behavior. So they started to develop these theories. Okay, well, if medications work, maybe those medications, they're increasing monoamines, which are serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline. So maybe it's just that we have too few monoamines, so way less serotonin, way less dopamine, and that's the reason why we get depressed. So one of the big reasons why we have this kind of chemical imbalance idea is that, because our medications work, right? So SSRIs like Prozac increase serotonin levels, and that improves depression. Therefore, depression must be caused by low levels of serotonin. But we have other types of depression drugs like tianeptine. Tianeptine is Stablon, or Coaxil. I haven't actually heard of those, but tianeptine decreases serotonin and also can improve depressive symptoms. So in that case, then we would kind of say, well, maybe it's actually too much serotonin, right? And people also get better on placebos. So there's a strong placebo effect with depression. So giving somebody a sugar pill, they also will get better, or there's like a 30% chance that they will get better. Lastly, it's kind of like saying well, because therapy improves depression, therefore it must be a lack of therapy that's causing depression. It kind of sounds weird, right? So this kind of idea is kind of faulty logic. And, something that we also need to know is that, well, does this mean that there's low serotonin? So, well, maybe we can just directly see, is there low serotonin in individuals who are depressed? And after doing some review studies, the answer is no. You can also deplete serotonin in individuals, and you still don't create depression unless you have some you're not going to create depression in people that haven't been depressed before. So this kind of idea that depression is just caused by chemical imbalance is really a myth. There's a lot more going on than just this chemical imbalance thing. And we can't really, we don't even really see a chemical imbalance in individuals who are depressed. So something to note is that, we really have to look at all the multiple causes. So while there might be something to be said about chemicals, it's not the end of the story. If you're at Cal State San Marcos, you can also watch more. Is mental illness just a chemical imbalance? Check that out if you're really interested. I'm going to end this here.